Chapter 31 of the Life of Hon. William F. Cody. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Barry Eads. The Life of Hon. William F. Cody by William F. Cody. Chapter 31 Dangerous Work. One evening while we were in camp on the Yellowstone at the mouth of Powder River, I was informed that the commanding officers had selected Louis Richard, a half-breed, and myself to accompany General Mills on a scouting expedition on the steamer Far West down the Yellowstone as far as Glendive Creek. We were to ride on the pilot house and keep a sharp lookout on both sides of the river for Indian trails that might have crossed the stream. The idea of scouting on a steamboat was indeed a novel one to me, and I anticipated a pleasant trip. At daylight next morning we reported on board the steamer to General Mills, who had with him 4 or 5 companies of his regiment. We were somewhat surprised when he asked us where our horses were, as we had not supposed that horses would be needed if the scouting was to be done on the steamer. He said we might need them before we got back, and thereupon had the animals brought on board. In a few minutes we were booming down the river, at the rate of about 20 miles an hour. The steamer Far West was commanded by Captain Grant Marsh, whom I found to be a brick. I had often heard of him, for he was and is yet one of the best known river captains in the country. He it was who, with his steamer the Far West, transported the wounded men from the battle of the Little Bighorn to Fort Abraham Lincoln on the Missouri River, and on that trip he made the fastest steamboat time on record. He was a skillful and experienced pilot, handling his boat with remarkable dexterity. While Richard and myself were at our stations on the pilot house, the steamer with a full head of steam went flying past islands, around bends, over sandbars, at a rate that was exhilarating. Presently I thought I could see horses grazing in a distant bend of the river, and I reported the fact to General Mills, who asked Captain Marsh if he could land the boat near a large tree which he pointed out to him. "Yes, sir, I can land her there, and make her climb the tree if necessary," said he. On reaching the spot designated, General Mills ordered 2 companies ashore, while Richard and myself were ordered to take our horses off the boat and push out as rapidly as possible to see if there were Indians in the vicinity. While we were getting ashore, Captain Marsh remarked that if there was only a good heavy dew on the grass, he would shoot the steamer ashore and take us on the scout without the trouble of leaving the boat. It was a false alarm, however, as the objects we had seen proved to be Indian graves. Quite a large number of braves, who had probably been killed in some battle, had been buried on scaffolds, according to the Indian custom, and some of their clothing had been torn loose from the bodies by the wolves and was waving in the air. On arriving at Glendive Creek, we found that Colonel Rice and his company of the 5th Infantry, who had been sent there by General Mills, had built quite a good little fort with their trowel bayonets, a weapon which Colonel Rice was the inventor of, and which is, by the way, a very useful implement of war, as it can be used for a shovel in throwing up entrenchments, and can be profitably utilized in several other ways. On the day previous to our arrival, Colonel Rice had a fight with a party of Indians, and had killed 2 or 3 of them at long range with his Rodman cannon. The Far West was to remain at Glendive overnight, and General Mills wished to send dispatches back to General Terry at once. At his request I took the dispatches and rode 75 miles that night through the bad lands of the Yellowstone, and reached General Terry's camp next morning, after having nearly broken my neck a dozen times or more. There being but little prospect of any more fighting, I determined to go east as soon as possible to organize a new dramatic combination, and have a new drama written for me, based upon the Sioux war. This I knew would be a paying investment, as the Sioux campaign had excited considerable interest. So I started down the river on the steamer Yellowstone, en route to Fort Beaufort. On the same morning Generals Terry and Crook pulled out for Powder River to take up the old Indian trail which we had recently left. The steamer had proceeded down the stream about 20 miles when it was met by another boat on its way up the river, having on board General Whistler and some fresh troops for General Terry's command. Both boats landed, and almost the first person I met was my old friend and partner, Texas Jack, who had been sent out as a dispatch carrier for the New York Herald. General Whistler, upon learning that General Terry had left the Yellowstone, asked me to carry to him some important dispatches from General Sheridan, and although I objected, he insisted upon my performing this duty, saying that it would only detain me a few hours longer. As an extra inducement he offered me the use of his own thoroughbred horse, which was on the boat. I finally consented to go, and was soon speeding over the rough and hilly country towards Powder River, and I delivered the dispatches to General Terry that same evening. General Whistler's horse, although a good animal, was not used to such hard riding, and was far more exhausted by the journey than I was. After I had taken a lunch, General Terry asked me if I would carry some dispatches back to General Whistler, and I replied that I would. Captain Smith, General Terry's aide de camp, offered me his horse for the trip, and it proved to be an excellent animal, for I rode him that same night 40 miles over the Bad Lands in 4 hours, and reached General Whistler's steamboat at 1 o'clock. During my absence the Indians had made their appearance on the different hills in the vicinity, and the troops from the boat had had several skirmishes with them. When General Whistler had finished reading the dispatches, he said: "Cody, I want to send information to General Terry concerning the Indians, who have been skirmishing around here all day. I have been trying all the evening long to induce some one to carry my dispatches to him, but no one seems willing to undertake the trip, and I have got to fall back on you. It is asking a great deal, I know, as you have just ridden 80 miles, but it is a case of necessity, and if you go, Cody, I'll see that you are well paid for it." "Never mind about the pay," said I, "but get your dispatches ready, and I'll start at once." In a few minutes he handed me the package, and mounting the same horse which I had ridden from General Terry's camp, I struck out for my destination. It was 2 o'clock in the morning when I left the boat, and at 8 o'clock I rode into General Terry's camp, just as he was about to march, having made 120 miles in 22 hours. General Terry, after reading the dispatches, halted his command, and then rode on and overtook General Crook, with whom he held a council. The result was that Crook's command moved on in the direction which they had been pursuing, while Terry's forces marched back to the Yellowstone and crossed the river on steamboats. At the urgent request of General Terry, I accompanied the command on a scout in the direction of the Dry Fork of the Missouri, where it was expected we would strike some Indians. The first march out from the Yellowstone was made in the night, as we wished to get into the hills without being discovered by the Sioux scouts. After marching 3 days, a little to the east of north, we reached the buffalo range and discovered fresh signs of Indians, who had evidently been killing buffaloes. General Terry now called on me to carry dispatches to Colonel Rice, who was still camped at the mouth of Glendive Creek on the Yellowstone, distant about 80 miles from us. Night had set in with a storm, and a drizzling rain was falling when, at 10 o'clock, I started on this ride through a section of country with which I was entirely unacquainted. I traveled through the darkness a distance of about 35 miles, and at daylight I rode into a secluded spot at the head of a ravine where stood a bunch of ash trees, and there I concluded to remain till night, for I considered it a dangerous undertaking to cross the wide prairies in broad daylight, especially as my horse was a poor one. I accordingly unsaddled my animal, and ate a hearty breakfast of bacon and hardtack, which I had stored in the saddle pockets. Then, after taking a smoke, I lay down to sleep with my saddle for a pillow. In a few minutes I was in the land of dreams. After sleeping some time, I can't tell how long, I was suddenly awakened by a roaring, rumbling sound. I instantly seized my gun, sprang to my horse, and hurriedly secreted him in the brush. Then I climbed up on the steep side of the bank, and cautiously looked over the summit. In the distance I saw a large herd of buffaloes which were being chased and fired at by 20 or 30 Indians. Occasionally a buffalo would drop out of the herd, but the Indians kept on until they had killed 10 or 15. They then turned back and began to cut up their game. I saddled my horse and tied him to a small tree where I could reach him conveniently in case the Indians should discover me by finding my trail and following it. I then crawled carefully back to the summit of the bluff, and in a concealed position watched the Indians for 2 hours, during which time they were occupied in cutting up the buffaloes and packing the meat on their ponies. When they had finished this work, they rode off in the direction whence they had come, and on the line which I had proposed to travel. It appeared evident to me that their camp was located somewhere between me and Glendive Creek, but I had no idea of abandoning the trip on that account. I waited till nightfall before resuming my journey, and then I bore off to the east for several miles, and by making a semicircle, to avoid the Indians, I got back on my original course, and then pushed on rapidly to Colonel Rice's camp, which I reached just at daylight. Colonel Rice had been fighting Indians almost every day since he had been encamped at this point, and he was very anxious to notify General Terry of the fact. Of course I was requested to carry his dispatches. After remaining at Glendive a single day, I started back to find General Terry, and on the 3rd day out I overhauled him at the head of Deer Creek while on his way to Colonel Rice's camp. He was not, however, going in the right direction, but bearing too far to the east, and so I informed him. He then asked me to guide the command, and I did so. On arriving at Glendive, I bade good bye to the General and his officers, and took passage on the steamer Far West, which was on her way down the Missouri. At Bismarck I left the steamer and proceeded by rail to Rochester, New York, where I met my family. Mr. J. Clinton Hall, manager of the Rochester Opera House, was very anxious to have me play an engagement at his theater. I agreed to open the season with him as soon as I had got my drama written, and I did so, meeting with an enthusiastic reception. My new drama was arranged for the stage by J. V. Arlington, the actor. It was a 5-act play, without head or tail, and it made no difference at which act we commenced the performance. Before we had finished the season, several newspaper critics, I have been told, went crazy in trying to follow the plot. It afforded us, however, ample opportunity to give a noisy, rattling gunpowder entertainment, and to present a succession of scenes in the late Indian War, all of which seemed to give general satisfaction. From Rochester I went to New York and played a very successful engagement at the Grand Opera House under the management of Messrs. Poole and Donnelly. Thence my route took me to all the principal cities in the Eastern, Western, and Middle States, and I everywhere met with crowded houses. I then went to the Pacific coast, against the advice of friends, who gave it as their opinion that my style of plays would not take very well in California. I opened for an engagement of 2 weeks at the Bush Street Theater in San Francisco, at a season when the theatrical business was dull, and Ben DeBar and the Lingards were playing there to empty seats. I expected to play to a slim audience on the opening night, but instead of that I had a $1,400 house. Such was my success that I continued my engagement for 5 weeks, and the theater was crowded at every performance. Upon leaving San Francisco, I made a circuit of the interior towns, and closed the season at Virginia City, Nevada. On my way east I met my family at Denver, where they were visiting my sisters Nellie and May, who were then residing there. Some time previously I had made arrangements to go into the cattle business, in company with my old friend, Major Frank North, and while I was in California he had built our ranches on the South Fork of the Dismal River, 65 miles north of North Platte, in Nebraska. Proceeding to Ogallala, the headquarters of the Texas cattle drovers, I found Major North there awaiting me, and together we bought, branded, and drove to our ranches our first installment of cattle. This occupied us during the remainder of the summer. Leaving the cattle in charge of Major North, I visited Red Cloud Agency early in the fall, and secured some Sioux Indians to accompany me on my theatrical tour of 1877-78. Taking my family and the Indians with me, I went directly to Rochester. There I left my oldest daughter Arta at a young ladies' seminary, while my wife and youngest child traveled with me during the season. I opened at the Bowery Theater, New York, September 3rd, 1877, with a new border drama entitled May Cody, or Lost and Won, from the pen of Major A.S. Burke of the United States Army. It was founded on the incidents of the Mountain Meadow Massacre and life among the Mormons. It was the best drama I had yet produced, and proved a grand success both financially and artistically. The season of 1877-78 proved to be the most profitable one I had ever had. In February, 1878, my wife became tired of traveling, and proceeded to North Platte, Nebraska, where, on our farm adjoining the town, she personally superintended the erection of a comfortable family residence, and had it all completed when I reached there, early in May. In this house we are now living, and we hope to make it our home for many years to come. End of chapter 31.